This is part 1 on our video on the English simple past tense. First, an introduction. There are 3 simple tenses in English. You see the green triangle in the middle is the present, that's right now. To the right in blue is the future. To the left in red is the past. We're going to focus on talking about the past tense. The simple past describes an activity in the past. We use the simple past to describe an activity that is finished, completed. That means it's over and done with. And it took place entirely in the past. To put it another way, the activity started and ended in the past. That's when we're going to use the simple past tense in English. There are other verb forms that we use to talk about the past. We will learn more about them later. For now, we will focus on the simple past tense. Let's talk about signal words and phrases. We use these words or phrases to let the listener know or the reader know what we're talking about. Signal words and phrases for the simple past include yesterday. They also include phrases that can be modified. For example, last, then we're going to insert a time period. Last night, last week, or a time period ago, a month ago, a year ago. We can say this and then a time period, this morning, this year, or we could say last night. And notice we don't say this night. We can say this morning, this year, this week, but last night is what we use instead of this night. Here are some sample sentences in the past tense. Yesterday, I went to school. Last night, I slept well. I bought a new car last week. He became a dad a month ago. We drove to Mexico a year ago. This morning, I heard birds outside my window. I saw so many good movies this year. Now, in all of these sentences, whatever I or the subject of the sentence did was completely in the past and it is over now. Let's focus on the verb to be in the simple past tense. The irregular verb to be. You've already seen in the simple present that the verb to be is irregular. It has 3 forms when most verbs only have 2. Other verbs in the simple past use the same conjugation for all persons. That makes the past tense an easy tense to use because you use the same form, whether your subject is I, or we, or Anna, or they. But not for the be verb. The be verb has 2 forms. If our subject is I, or she, he, it, or somebody's name like Tom or Mary, or a thing like the chair, we're going to use the word was in the affirmative, and we'll say was not or wasn't for the negative. If our subject is you, we, or they, or a phrase like Joe and I, or Tom and Bobby, we're going to use were in our affirmative sentences, and were not, or the contraction weren't, in our negative sentences. Here is the format for the verb to be in simple sentences in the past. The affirmative format is just like the present tense. We have a subject followed by was or were, depending on our subject, and then we finish the sentence with a complete meaning. Negative, it's very similar to the present tense as well. Subject, was, were, plus the word not, and then finish with something to give the sentence a complete meaning. Let's look at examples. I was an attorney from 1986 to 2000. Margaret was happy. She was awarded a prize for the best essay. Henry was the first person to finish the test. He was sure he passed the test. The dog was hungry. It was looking for its food dish. And now we're going to look at were. You were the last person in the race. Sandra and I were late to class. We were tardy. Elliot and Tom were students last year. They were excited to be back in the classroom. On the negative format, here are some examples using was. I was not happy with my grade. Frank wasn't a bad student, and notice here I've used a contraction. He wasn't a very good student either. Susie was not hungry. She wasn't ready for dinner. The table wasn't clean. It was not cleaned after the last meal. And most English speakers will use a combination of contractions and saying the complete phrase out, as in, I was not happy with my grade. It's a matter of preference. Either form is going to be correct. More examples now using were. You weren't on time to class. Max and I were not interested in the movie. We weren't impressed with the storyline. Max and Carlo weren't in their room. They weren't where they were supposed to be. Now let's look at the format if we're going to ask a question. We're going to begin with yes, no questions. Here's the format in the simple past if we're asking a question using an affirmative sense. We begin with the verb was. If our subject is I, she, he, it, or somebody's name like Tom, or a thing like the car, and then we'll finish with a complete meaning, as in asleep. So for example, was I asleep? And here my complete meaning is an adjective. If we begin with were, it's because our subject is you, we, they, or people's names like Elliot and I, or Bob and Lucy, and then we finish with a complete meaning. For example, were they teachers? And here our complete meaning is a noun. Let's look at some examples. Was I late yesterday? Was Margaret happy about her new job? Was she on time for her first day? Was Henry the last person to finish the test? Was he tired afterward? Was the dog outside all day? Was it cold? Now let's look at sentences using were. Were you cold last night? Were Sandra and I in the right room yesterday? Were we in the wrong room? Were Elliot and Tom engineering students? Were they students at ASU? Now, sometimes we ask a yes/no question, but we put a negative in the question itself. Let's look at that. We start with the verb plus the word not, then the subject, then the complete meaning, as in, wasn't I early? I also use wasn't if my subject is she, he, or it. We use weren't when our subject is you, we, they. For example, weren't they students? And notice, in this question format, it is very common to use the contraction. Most native speakers will find it odd if I asked, was I not early? The sentence is correct. It just sounds a little odd to native English speakers. Here are some examples. Wasn't I the first person to class? Wasn't Frank the winner? Wasn't he the first to cross the finish line? Wasn't Susie hungry? Wasn't she ready for dinner? Wasn't the table clean? Wasn't it cleaned after the last meal? Now let's look with were. Weren't you happy with your grade? Weren't we included in the invitation? Weren't Max and Carlo in their room? Weren't they together? We can also use WH questions in the simple past. And WH stands for question words like where, when, what, who, why, and how is included even though it's not a WH. So we begin with the question word, the verb was. If our subject is I, she, he, or it, we use were if the subject is you, we, or they. For example, where was I? When was Margaret at work? Who was at the door? What time was the class? Why was the dog outside all day? How was it? Now using were, when were you the happiest? Where were Sam and I when the bus arrived? What time were we in class? Who were they? When were they late for their appointment? How were they after they got the news? Our next video is going to continue with verbs other than to be.